I was 12 when they told me my father was dead. The words came from my mother's mouth like broken glass, cutting through the silence of our kitchen on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other until it wasn't. There was an accident, she said, her voice hollow and mechanical, as if she were reading from a script she'd memorized but never believed. He won't be coming home anymore. The thing about grief is that it's supposed to feel like drowning, but what I felt was more like being suspended in amber, frozen, unable to move forward or backward, just existing in this strange, suffocating space where nothing made sense. I kept waiting for the tears to come, for the dramatic collapse I'd seen in movies, but instead, I just stared at the cereal growing soggy in my bowl and wondered why the milk looked the same when everything else had changed.
My Mutter never cried.
Not once. Not during the hushed phone calls with relatives, not when she packed away his clothes with the efficiency of someone cleaning out a storage unit, not even when I asked her why we couldn't visit his grave. He was cremated, she'd say, turning away from me like the conversation was over before it began. There's nothing to visit. But there were things that didn't add up, little fractures in the story that caught the light wrong. Like how his brother, Uncle Mark, would start to say something at family gatherings and then stop mid-sentence, his eyes darting to my mother with an expression I couldn't name. Or how all of Dad's photos seemed to have vanished except for one school portrait of him that looked like it belonged to someone else's childhood. Or how, when I asked my grandmother about the accident, she'd get this look, not sad but guilty, like she'd been caught stealing candy from a store. The silence in our house became its own presence, heavy and watchful. I learned to navigate around it, to keep my questions small and my grief private. I taught myself to miss a man I was starting to realize I'd never really known, to mourn someone whose absence felt more like erasure than death. My mother remarried when I was 15, to a man who tried too hard to be gentle with me, who spoke about my father in past tense like he was reading from a sympathy card. At 16, I found myself staring at other girls with their fathers, studying them like they were specimens from another planet. The way they rolled their eyes when their dads embarrassed them, the casual way they asked for money or rides, the assumption that someone would always be there to catch them if they fell. I envied them so deeply it felt like hunger, this gnawing ache for something I couldn't even properly name because I'd never really had it. The nightmares started around then. Not about death or accidents, but about searching. Endless dreams where I'd walk through empty houses calling for someone who never answered. I'd wake up with his name on my lips, a name that felt foreign in my mouth because I'd said it so rarely, because no one else ever spoke it anymore.
David.
My father's name was David, and sometimes I'd whisper it to myself in the dark just to make sure I still remembered how it sounded. I started keeping a journal, filling it with fragments of memories that might have been real or might have been wishful thinking. The way he smelled like coffee and aftershave. The sound of his laugh. Did he laugh? I thought he did, but the memory was so faint it might have been someone else's father bleeding into my recollections. The way he'd supposedly called me little bird, though I couldn't remember ever hearing those words from his mouth. By 18, I'd built an entire mythology around my dead father, turning him into something between a ghost and a saint. I told my college friends about him in careful, practiced sentences, painting him as a man who'd loved me completely in the brief time we'd had together. I made him into the father I'd needed him to be, because it was easier than admitting that even when he was alive, he'd felt like an absence in my life. The lie became comfortable, familiar. It was easier to be the girl with the tragic backstory than the girl who'd been abandoned, easier to grieve than to rage. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between classes or late at night when sleep wouldn't come, I'd catch myself listening for something. A footstep in the hallway, a key in the lock, the sound of someone coming home who never would. The first crack in the wall of lies came when I was 23, sorting through my grandmother's things after her funeral. She'd been the keeper of family secrets, the one who'd flush and change the subject whenever I asked too many questions about my father. In her bedroom closet, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and moth-eaten sweaters, I found a shoebox that felt too heavy for its size. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to her in my father's handwriting, postmarked from a town 3 hours away. The dates made my hands shake. Letters from last year, from 2 years ago, from every year since his supposed death. My father's voice, alive on paper, talking about his job at a hardware store, about his wife's garden, about how his son had made the baseball team and his daughter had lost her first tooth. I sat on my grandmother's bedroom floor, surrounded by the detritus of her life, and felt my entire world reorganize itself around this impossible truth. My father wasn't dead. He was living 3 hours away with a family who knew his laugh, who shared his dinner table, who had never wondered if he'd really existed at all. The return address was burned into my mind by the time I made it home to my apartment. I spent 3 days staring at my laptop screen, satellite images of a suburban street where my father apparently lived, trying to reconcile the man who'd written about his children's achievements with the ghost I'd been mourning for over a decade. When I finally called my mother, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "I found the letters," I said, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tired, like she'd been waiting for this moment for years. "I can explain," she said, but I hung up before she could try. The explanations came later, in a coffee shop where my mother looked older than I'd ever seen her, her hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from. She told me about the affair, about how he'd left us for another woman when I was barely old enough to remember him clearly. She told me about the divorce papers, about the custody arrangement he'd never followed through on, about how he'd simply vanished from our lives like we'd never existed. "I thought you were better off thinking he was dead," she said, her voice breaking for the first time in my memory. "I thought it would hurt less than knowing he'd chosen to leave you." But I wasn't better off. I was furious, hollow, desperate. I'd spent 11 years grieving a man who was out there living his life, who'd never even tried to contact me, who'd let me believe he was gone forever rather than face the inconvenience of being my father. The drive to his town felt like falling backward through time. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, practiced conversations in my rearview mirror, but when I finally parked across from his house, a modest 2-story with a swing set in the backyard and a garden that must have belonged to the wife he'd mentioned in his letters, all my words evaporated. I watched him for an hour before I got up the courage to approach. He was older, grayer, but unmistakably the man from the single photo I'd carried in my wallet like a talisman. He was washing his car in the driveway, and there was something so painfully normal about the scene that I wanted to scream. This was where he'd been while I was learning to drive, graduating high school, starting college. This ordinary suburban afternoon was what he'd chosen over knowing me. When I finally walked across the street, he looked up from his car and I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been panic. He said my name, and I realized he'd been keeping track of me after all, had been watching from a distance while pretending I didn't exist. "Emma," he said, and it was the first time I'd heard my name in his voice since I was a child. "What are you doing here?"
The question hung between us like a challenge.
What was I doing there? What had I expected to find? I looked at this man who'd shaped my entire understanding of loss and love, who'd been the ghost haunting every relationship I'd ever tried to have, and I couldn't find a single word that felt adequate. Behind him, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out. His wife, I realized, the one who'd never had to wonder if he'd loved her enough to stay. She was holding a dish towel and wearing an expression of polite concern that shifted to something else when she saw me standing there, when she noticed the way my father's face had gone pale. "David," she called. "Is everything okay?" And in that moment, hearing her say his name with such casual familiarity, I understood that I wasn't just discovering that my father was alive. I was discovering that I was the secret he'd been keeping from his real family, the ghost he'd been hiding in his own closet. The woman who stepped out of my father's house looked exactly like someone who'd never had to fight for his attention. She was pretty in an understated way, with laugh lines around her eyes and flour on her apron that suggested she'd been baking cookies for children who'd never wondered if their father would come home. Her name was Linda, and when my father reluctantly introduced me, I watched her face transform from puzzled politeness to something approaching horror. "This is Emma," he said, the words coming out like they were being dragged from him.
My Daukata.
The silence that followed was so profound I could hear a lawnmower 3 houses away, could hear the sound of children playing in someone else's backyard. Linda's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to catch her breath underwater, and I realized with a sick sort of satisfaction that I wasn't the only one whose world was being rearranged. "You have a daughter," she said finally, her voice pitched higher than normal. "David, you said you didn't have any children before we married." And there it was, the confirmation of what I'd suspected. I wasn't just the daughter he'd abandoned, I was the daughter he'd erased completely, the inconvenient truth he'd buried so deep that even his wife of 15 years had never heard my name. The next few minutes were a blur of awkward introductions and stammered explanations. Linda invited me inside with the kind of desperate politeness that comes from years of smoothing over social situations, and I found myself sitting in a living room that felt like a museum of the life my father had chosen instead of me. Photos of his new family covered every surface: birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations to beaches I'd never seen. In every single picture, he looked happy in a way I'd never seen before, relaxed and present in a way that made my chest tighten with something beyond jealousy. His other children were there too: Michael, who was 17 and had my father's eyes, and Sarah, who was 14 and wore her skepticism like armor. They sat on the couch across from me, studying me with the frank curiosity of teenagers who'd just discovered their father had been living a completely different life than the one they'd known. "So you're like our sister?" Sarah asked, and the question hit me like a physical blow. Sister. I'd never had siblings, had never had anyone to share the weight of family history with, and now I was discovering that these two strangers had been living the life that should have been mine. My father, David, sat in his chair like a man facing execution, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He kept looking at me and then looking away, as if he couldn't decide whether I was real or just another nightmare he'd have to wake up from. "I can explain," he said, the same words my mother had used, but I was done with explanations. I was done with being the secret everyone else had to manage, the ghost everyone else had to live with. "You let me think you were dead," I said, and my voice sounded stronger than I felt. "For 11 years, I mourned you. I visited therapists who helped me process my grief. I chose not to date men who reminded me of you because I was afraid of losing them too. I built my entire identity around being the girl whose father died tragically young, and you were here the whole time, making pancakes and teaching your son to drive and pretending I never existed." Linda's face was pale now, her earlier shock replaced by something that looked like anger. "You had a child and you never told me? We've been married for 15 years, David."
15 years.
It was complicated, he said, but his voice sounded hollow even to me. "Her mother and I. Things ended badly. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just started fresh." "Easier for who?" I asked, and I could hear my voice rising, could feel 11 years of carefully controlled grief transforming into something sharp and dangerous.
Easier for you?
Because it wasn't easier for me. It wasn't easier for the 12-year-old who kept waiting for her father to come home, who kept thinking maybe if she was better, smarter, prettier, he'd find a way to come back from the dead. Michael and Sarah were watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their eyes wide with the kind of fascination that comes from seeing the adult world reveal its cracks. I wanted to apologize to them, to explain that I hadn't come here to destroy their family, but I couldn't find the words because I wasn't sure it wasn't exactly what I'd wanted to do. The confrontation could have gone on for hours, could have devolved into the kind of screaming match that neighbors remember years later, but it was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Through the window, I could see a pizza delivery driver getting out of his car, and the mundane reality of it. The fact that this family had ordered dinner, that life was supposed to continue normally after my world had been turned upside down, struck me as almost funny. "I should go," I said, standing up so quickly that Linda startled. "I didn't come here to ruin your family. I needed to see you. I needed to know that you were real." My father stood too, and for a moment I thought he might try to stop me, might say something that would make the last 11 years make sense. Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph, wallet-sized, creased from years of being carried around. It was my school picture from 7th grade, the one where I'd been trying so hard to smile despite the braces and the awkward haircut. "I never forgot you," he said, holding out the photograph like an offering. "I know how this looks, but I never forgot you." I stared at that picture, at my own face, younger and more hopeful than I'd ever feel again, and I felt something inside me break open. He'd been carrying me around all these years, had been thinking about me while he was living his other life, and somehow that made it worse. It meant he'd known exactly what he was doing when he chose to let me believe he was dead. I didn't take the picture. Instead, I walked to the door, past Linda who was crying now, past his children who were watching me with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. I paused at the threshold, looking back at this man who'd shaped my entire understanding of love and loss, and I realized that I had a choice to make.
I could stay angry.
I could nurse this rage for the rest of my life, could let it define me the way his absence had defined me. Or I could choose something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of letting go that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. I hope you were happy, I said finally, and I meant it. I hope it was worth it. I drove home through the darkness, past the suburbs where fathers tucked their children into bed and mothers cleaned up after dinner, past the ordinary lives I'd spent so long feeling excluded from. When I got back to my apartment, I called my mother and told her I understood why she'd lied to me, told her I loved her for trying to protect me from this exact moment. 3 months later, I received a letter from my father. Not a card or an email, but a real letter, written on stationery from the hardware store where he worked. In it, he tried to explain himself, tried to make sense of choices that had seemed reasonable at the time but looked cruel in retrospect. He told me about the guilt he'd carried, about the nights he'd lain awake wondering what kind of person I'd become. He told me he was proud of me, though he had no right to be, and that he was sorry for the years we'd lost. I never wrote back. Not because I was still angry, but because I'd finally learned the difference between the father I'd needed and the man he'd actually been. I kept the letter though, filed away with my grandmother's letters and the single photo of him I'd carried for so long. Evidence of a life that had happened, of love that had been real even if it hadn't been enough. Sometimes I still dream about him, but they're different dreams now. In them, he's not the ghost I spent so long chasing, but just a man who made choices that hurt people, who tried to start over and ended up creating more pain than healing. In the dreams, I'm not the abandoned daughter anymore. I'm just a woman who learned that some stories don't have happy endings, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to write a different story for yourself. I never contacted Michael and Sarah, but I think about them sometimes, wonder if they ask their father about me, if they understand now that family is more complicated than anyone wants to admit. I hope they're kinder to him than I was, hope they never have to learn what it feels like to be someone's secret shame. And sometimes, on the worst days, I allow myself to wonder what might have happened if he'd chosen differently, if he'd been brave enough to include me in his new life instead of erasing me from his old one. But those thoughts don't serve anyone, least of all me. The only choice that matters now is the one I make every morning when I wake up, whether to spend another day haunted by his absence, or to finally, truly, let him go.